My name is Nicholson. I'm from Arup, which is a design consultancy. It doesn't particularly have a long history of working in natural flood management, but no one does really, apart from Paul. Uh, my talk really is about the progress we've made on recent design projects in terms of finding opportunities for natural flood management and then developing that further into detailed design work. So some of the things I'll be talking to you about today. What is NFM? That's kind of been covered. I suppose you're here because you know what it is. A bit of basics on how to look for opportunities and how to quantify those opportunities. And like I say, some small-scale feasibility, detailed design, some large-scale opportunity mapping, and a bit of a word on Arup research that we've been doing in recent years. So natural flood management was defined in 2011, I think, as the alteration, restoration, or use of landscape features to reduce flood risk. But put simply, it's putting interventions, as Paul says, into the landscape that slow, store, and do other things to the water to make it better. So main objective is to reduce downstream flows by attenuating it, altering the downstream flow hydrograph. Reducing the energy of water on the surface of the land and in our river channels to reduce erosion, sediment delivery. So that can improve water quality and sediment issues downstream, saving water companies some money. There's also the idea that you're creating things sometimes out of natural materials, and you're doing it in a more natural environment. So there's the opportunity to create habitat. And something that we're probably not going to talk about much today because we're talking about flood risk management, but this man, Rajendra Singh, is standing in front of a johad in India, and he used these to recharge aquifers. So using the same techniques by trapping stormwater during monsoons, he trapped and recharged aquifers and made huge areas of land productive agriculture again. And he won the World Water Prize in 2015 from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Some drivers for change. Since probably about 2013-14, I think we've been hearing a lot more about natural flood management in the news. Some people saying plant 1 million trees and we'll stop flooding, and all sorts of stories that lots of people getting behind a kind of movement in natural flood management. There's also been the development of natural flood management handbooks from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. Paul was part of a committee for the House of Commons to take a look at how we're defending against flooding now and what we could do better in the future. And interestingly, an independent film was produced that looked at communities that were stricken throughout the UK to look at how we could make flooding more cost-effective, flood defencing more cost-effective. And it's called High Water Common Ground. I thought it might be useful to differentiate between natural flood management and the concepts of rewilding. Rewilding examples include Yellowstone National Park, which you may have heard of, where they reintroduced some apex predators, wolves, into Yellowstone. That altered the breeding and feeding patterns of deer and other elk and other herbivores. That also changed the patterns of lots of other animals. And what happened was, it's termed trophic cascade, but the primary apex predator changes the behavior of all the animals beneath it. And eventually what happened after 30 years was that because the vegetation wasn't being eaten by all the herbivores, and it meant that the river could restore, sediment was kept where it was meant to be, and we had this huge change in the response of that catchment. In the UK, further to home, in Devon, there's been trials of the reintroduction of beaver to see what the impacts could be for flood risk. And some of those study results are looking very interesting. Still yet to see some final results from that. But that's more of whilst I feel it's a really good way and a positive way we should be heading towards. We should be putting our faith in nature because nature does a good job. What natural flood management is more of an engineered solution. It's us deciding where to put things and how we think nature would have dealt with this issue. So how I've been doing this in Arup is I've been analysing large amounts of topographic data to look for opportunities in river catchments where you might start to intervene with the runoff. This is the River Don catchment to Sheffield down here, and these are all the runoff routes that occur in that catchment. It's 375 square kilometres, which is a large scale for considering natural flood management. So by thinking about opportunities where runoff happens and thinking of ways to simulate those catchment areas in a modelling framework, we've been able to quantify what bits of runoff are coming from which areas of the catchment, and how does intervening with those certain areas of runoff change flooding response far downstream in Sheffield. And it's given us a framework of analysing opportunities and the impact of those opportunities. I'll just go through a couple of small-scale examples. For a 2.5 square kilometre catchment in Staffordshire, we analysed again, used the topography to map runoff, to design and propose 30 natural flood management features in the landscape and the agricultural area, and then we wanted to see what the impact would be downstream in the village. We combined this in the modelling with a traditional suite of measures, including raised walls, straightened channels, improved conveyance in the village, and we assessed the feasibility of engaging 13 or so landowners in the river catchment, and so we ruled out certain features on the basis that that we couldn't engage with that many people in the timescales, and these were the 4 primary landowners that we decided to engage with, who are going through to the scheme, and the scheme has now received funding from the Environment Agency to go to the next stage for its next business case. So we mapped almost 16,000 metres cubed of water storage in those features across the catchment, and that yielded in the 100-year event a 30% reduction in flood risk in the village. And we did that by breaking up the subcatchments into 2 and looking at the impact of the natural flood management features in each of those areas. And by looking at the flood frequency curve, sorry, this is the last graph, but by looking at the flood frequency in the village from the 2-year event all the way up to the 500-year event, we were able to show that without natural flood management would be this blue line, and these would be the magnitudes of flood risk associated with the return period. By increasing storage in the catchment, we were able to show that all these return periods would be slightly attenuated and would have an altered flood risk pattern in the village. And we were able to show that certain properties would move risk bands, and we could show that we could draw down funding using flood defence grant and aid funding from the Environment Agency. We then costed those features using some traditional techniques from engineering price guides. A more detailed design that myself and Paul are looking at the moment is the Lustrum Beck natural flood management scheme upstream of Stockton-On-Tees. The scheme there is a traditional scheme protecting the city up to a standard of protection of 1 in 75 years. And the idea is that by storing water upstream, we can raise that standard of protection from 1 in 75 to 1 in 100 and protect slightly more properties. There's 150 properties at risk of flooding, so it's a flagship scheme for the EA in terms of natural flood management. Some of the things that we have to consider here, obviously we need to reduce flood risk, keeping natural at the forefront. So we're not trying to build a fixed raised reservoir. We're trying to create lots of more natural looking features out of natural materials. We have to consider that if we're going to push water from a river onto a floodplain and that wouldn't naturally have got there in the first place, what happens to fish if they're ended up stranded on the floodplain? So we're altering the topography of the floodplain so that everything drains back towards the river after the floodwaters recede. There's great crested newt on site. There's otter and not beaver, badger and other. That would be great if there were some beaver there. They would really help us out. So we've got to consider all those things. The other really important point is the Reservoirs Act. It limits you to building 25,000 metres cubed of water storage in any one place above ground level. So we're trying to avoid having to exceed that, and therefore the panel engineers that come with that and the added paperwork and increased rigour of health and safety that goes with that. So obviously we're designing safe features, but we'd want to keep below that storage threshold. In terms of large scale, I touched upon the River Don catchment, the Sheffield example at the beginning. Sorry, I'm going over. All I wanted to say here was that using GIS methods, analysing all the available data, I actually went through the catchment. I physically drew 1,500 NFM features into a map, which was mind-numbing, but it took a long time. In a larger scale example, this is the Lower Lee example in Cork in Ireland. It was a 1,200 square kilometre catchment, and I had to map more than 5,000 different NFM features. And I thought to do that, if I had to do that using the traditional way that I developed last time, it would be I don't know. I don't think I'd still be here today. So I used a statistical assessment of lots of different information, land cover, topographic information, to find basically a selection of grid squares in which to analyse manually, and then apply the findings from those grid squares over the entire area. So it's a statistical comparison. And just a quick one, in the last few years, Arup have developed some tools on natural flood management and invested a lot of money into it, including a new piece of research that it will be reporting on before the end of the financial year, about using high-resolution satellite imagery to map land use and land cover, because one of the things I haven't mentioned is the impact of land cover, tree planting, peatland restoration, river restoration, and better management of our soils. It's something that, from a modelling side, is very difficult to do at the moment, and you can use methods, but to find your opportunities, you might need some new tools. So we're using a machine learning technique, an algorithm. This is a simplified version of it, but to analyse satellite imagery, tell us what's in that image, so that we can translate that into a hydrological model and think of new opportunities for natural flood management.